On the morning of April 15, 1945, inside Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Reims, Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a reality few commanders ever confront. The war in Europe was effectively won, yet the most dangerous phase of command still lay ahead. German resistance was collapsing, Allied armies were advancing on every front, and victory was no longer in question. What remained uncertain was how that victory would end, and whether it would fracture the alliance that had made it possible. For Eisenhower, this moment was not about achieving the fastest possible victory. It was about preventing a catastrophic political aftermath. By mid-April 1945, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine, broken through Germany's last natural defensive barriers, and penetrated deep into the heart of the Reich. Patton's Third Army surged eastward. British forces advanced from the northwest. The Red Army was closing in on Berlin from the east. Every commander on the ground sensed the same thing: Germany was finished. The question was no longer how to win, but who would control what came next. Many American generals believed this was the moment to push harder, move faster, and seize as much ground as possible before the Soviets arrived. Patton openly argued that American forces should drive east aggressively, even into areas already discussed as Soviet occupation zones. He believed momentum should be exploited fully, not restrained by diplomatic caution. In purely military terms, his argument had merit. Eisenhower rejected it. This decision would define the final weeks of the war. Eisenhower had spent months preparing for this exact dilemma. Since early 1944, he had understood that coalition warfare was not just about defeating a common enemy. It was about managing competing national interests without allowing them to tear the alliance apart. Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union shared a goal, but they did not share a future. Eisenhower knew that how the war ended would shape Europe for decades. On April 11, 1945, Eisenhower issued a directive that stunned some of his commanders. He made it clear that Berlin was no longer an American objective. Instead, Allied forces would focus on destroying remaining German armies, securing agreed-upon occupation zones, and preventing unnecessary clashes with Soviet forces. To many frontline commanders, this sounded like restraint at the moment of victory. To Eisenhower, it was survival of the alliance. The Red Army had already suffered millions of casualties. Stalin expected recognition of Soviet sacrifice through territorial control. Any American attempt to race the Soviets for Berlin risked more than military confrontation. It risked political rupture. Eisenhower understood that a single misstep could transform allies into adversaries before the war had even officially ended. He also understood something his critics often overlook. Results without unity could be disastrous. A faster capture of Berlin by American forces might have looked impressive in headlines, but it would not have changed Germany's surrender. What it would have changed was Soviet trust. Eisenhower believed that humiliating or sidelining the Soviets at the moment of victory could poison relations irreparably. Given the power imbalance already forming, that was a risk he refused to take. This philosophy shaped every major decision Eisenhower made in the war's final weeks. When Patton pushed aggressively toward Czechoslovakia, Eisenhower allowed progress but reinforced boundaries. When British commanders pressed for symbolic victories, Eisenhower redirected focus to coordination. He emphasized destruction of enemy forces over territorial competition. Some saw this as weakness, others saw it as discipline. Eisenhower's critics argued that he was sacrificing opportunity for diplomacy. They believed the Allies should have seized as much ground as possible while they could. Eisenhower countered that victory achieved at the cost of unity was not victory at all. The war had already proven that fractured alliances led to catastrophe. He refused to let that happen again at the moment of success. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower expressed his concerns bluntly. He feared that aggressive competition between allies would create incidents on the ground that could spiral out of control. A clash between American and Soviet patrols, even accidental, could escalate rapidly. The presence of millions of armed men, exhausted and tense, made restraint not just wise but necessary. Eisenhower's role at this stage was no longer purely military. He had become a political stabilizer. His authority rested not on battlefield heroics, but on trust. Trust between nations, trust between commanders, trust that agreements would be honored even when temptation beckoned. By late April, this approach had already prevented several potential flashpoints. Allied patrols halted at agreed lines. Communications were maintained. Mutual respect, however fragile, held. Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945. The war ended without a single Allied confrontation. For Eisenhower, this outcome mattered as much as the victory itself. Many would later argue that Eisenhower missed an opportunity to shape the post-war world more decisively. Others would credit him with preventing a crisis that could have ignited a new war before the old one had even finished. What cannot be disputed is that Eisenhower made a conscious choice. He chose unity over spectacle, stability over speed, long-term peace over short-term results. And in doing so, he revealed that the hardest decisions of war are often made when the fighting is almost over. As April 1945 progressed, Eisenhower's decision to prioritize unity over immediate results began to provoke open frustration among several senior commanders. The fighting was nearly finished, yet orders emphasized restraint, coordination, and adherence to agreed boundaries. For generals who had spent years driving relentlessly toward victory, this shift felt unnatural, even insulting. George Patton was the most vocal critic. In private diary entries dated April 17 and April 18, 1945, Patton expressed disbelief that American forces were being restrained when German resistance was clearly collapsing. He argued that history would not forgive hesitation at the moment of opportunity. Patton believed that seizing more territory before Soviet arrival was not aggression, but prudence. To him, power respected power, and momentum once lost could never be regained. Eisenhower read similar sentiments in reports from other commanders, though few stated them as bluntly as Patton. Omar Bradley shared some of Patton's frustration, but unlike Patton, Bradley understood the political dimension Eisenhower was navigating. He supported Eisenhower publicly, even when privately conflicted. Bradley recognized that the war's final phase was no longer governed purely by battlefield logic. Eisenhower's correspondence during this period reveals the weight of the decision he had made. In messages exchanged with Washington in mid-April, he emphasized the importance of preventing misunderstandings with Soviet forces. He warned that a single unauthorized advance could undo months of diplomatic coordination. Eisenhower had already seen how fragile trust could be in coalition warfare. He refused to let the alliance fracture when the enemy was already defeated. On April 21, 1945, Eisenhower received confirmation that Soviet forces had entered the outskirts of Berlin. For Patton and others, this was confirmation that restraint had cost prestige. For Eisenhower, it confirmed that his decision was correct. Any attempt to race the Soviets would have arrived too late and risked confrontation for no gain. Eisenhower's reasoning was rooted in experience. He had spent the war mediating disputes between strong personalities, managing national pride, and maintaining cooperation under extraordinary pressure. He understood that military success did not exist in a vacuum. It shaped political outcomes whether commanders intended it or not. One of Eisenhower's greatest fears was that aggressive competition at the end of the war would create incidents that could not be undone. Allied patrols meeting Soviet units without clear guidance could escalate quickly. A firefight, even accidental, could trigger retaliation. With millions of armed men in close proximity, restraint was not weakness, it was control. British leaders largely supported Eisenhower's approach. Winston Churchill, though privately concerned about Soviet expansion, recognized that open confrontation before Germany's surrender would be disastrous. He trusted Eisenhower to manage the balance between firmness and cooperation. The British military, exhausted by years of war, had little appetite for new conflicts. Eisenhower's choice also reflected his understanding of American public expectations. The United States had fought to end the war, not to begin another. Any perception that American forces were provoking conflict with the Soviets could undermine support at home. Eisenhower believed the American people would judge success not by how far east troops advanced, but by whether the war ended cleanly. As German resistance continued to crumble, Eisenhower doubled down on his directive. He instructed commanders to focus on disarming enemy units, securing infrastructure, and preparing for occupation duties. He emphasized discipline, caution, and communication. These were not glamorous tasks, but they were essential to a stable transition. Patton complied outwardly, but his resentment grew. He believed Eisenhower was allowing the Soviets to gain strategic advantage without resistance. This belief would later fuel Patton's outspoken criticism of post-war policy, further straining his relationship with higher command. Eisenhower was aware of Patton's views and chose not to silence him immediately. He understood Patton's value and his frustrations, but Eisenhower also knew that unchecked dissent could undermine authority. The final weeks of the war required unity not just among nations, but among commanders. By late April, Allied forces reached their assigned limits. Soviet and American units met along the Elbe River on April 25, 1945. The meeting was carefully managed, photographed, and publicized as a symbol of unity. Eisenhower viewed this moment as proof that restraint had succeeded. The alliance had held through victory. Germany's unconditional surrender followed less than 2 weeks later. The war in Europe ended without a single serious clash between Allied forces. For Eisenhower, this outcome validated his approach. Unity had been preserved. The enemy had been defeated. The transition to peace, though complex, began without immediate catastrophe. Yet Eisenhower knew that his decision would be debated for generations. He accepted that criticism was inevitable. Some would argue he sacrificed leverage. Others would argue he prevented disaster. Eisenhower himself viewed the choice as unavoidable. The alliance had to survive the victory, not just achieve it. The final judgment of his decision would not come on the battlefield, but in the decades that followed. In the months and years after the war, Dwight D. Eisenhower rarely spoke publicly about the restraint he imposed in April 1945. When he did, his language was measured, almost clinical. Victory, he insisted, had never been in doubt. What had been in doubt was whether that victory would end the war or merely transform it into something even more dangerous. In June 1945, as Supreme Allied Commander, responsibilities gave way to occupation duties. Eisenhower reflected privately on the final weeks of the campaign. In correspondence later preserved in the Eisenhower Presidential Library, he acknowledged that military logic alone could not govern decisions once Germany's defeat became inevitable. He wrote that, "Coalition that fractures at the moment of triumph risks losing the peace it has just won." For Eisenhower, unity was not an abstract ideal. It was a strategic necessity. Critics continued to argue that Eisenhower had surrendered leverage to the Soviets by halting deeper advances into central and eastern Germany. They claimed that American forces could have seized Berlin or pushed farther east, potentially altering post-war boundaries. Eisenhower never denied that such advances were militarily possible. What he denied was that they would have produced a better outcome. By the time Allied armies stood on the Elbe in late April 1945, agreements made at Yalta had already outlined occupation zones. Eisenhower believed that violating those agreements would have immediate consequences. The Red Army was not a defeated foe. It was a massive, battle-hardened force that had borne the brunt of Germany's resistance. Any attempt to exclude or outmaneuver it at the last moment could have provoked confrontation on the ground, where diplomacy had little room to operate. Eisenhower's understanding of this risk deepened as he assumed the presidency years later. As a former Supreme Allied Commander, he carried with him a rare perspective. He had seen how easily alliances could collapse under pressure. As president, he faced the Cold War realities that emerged from the very victory he had helped secure. In later speeches, Eisenhower hinted that restraint in 1945 had delayed, though not prevented, confrontation between former allies. His critics often overlooked a key point. Eisenhower did not choose unity over results because he feared competition. He chose it because he understood that results achieved without unity were unstable. A divided alliance at the moment of victory would have created a vacuum of trust, one that could have been filled only by suspicion and force. Patton's views did not fade with the war's end. Before his death in December 1945, he continued to argue that the Soviets were the next inevitable enemy. History would partially vindicate his concerns, but not his timing. Eisenhower believed that confronting the Soviets prematurely, while Europe lay in ruins and millions were displaced, would have been reckless. The war had exhausted every nation involved. Another conflict, begun in misunderstanding or pride, would have been catastrophic. Eisenhower also understood something deeply human about war's end. Soldiers who had survived years of combat were not prepared for ambiguity. They wanted clear enemies, clear objectives, clear conclusions. Restraint felt like betrayal to men who had fought their way across continents. Eisenhower bore that resentment quietly, believing it preferable to the alternative. As historians later examined the final months of the war, many came to appreciate the complexity of Eisenhower's decision. He was not a battlefield tactician in the mold of Patton or Montgomery. He was a coordinator, a mediator, a leader whose greatest strength lay in holding competing forces together. The end of the war demanded those skills more than brilliance on the battlefield. The symbolic meeting of American and Soviet troops at the Elbe on April 25, 1945, captured this philosophy perfectly. The image of former allies shaking hands over a defeated enemy became a defining photograph of the war's end. Eisenhower saw in it proof that restraint had meaning. The alliance had reached victory intact. Yet unity did not last. Within months, tensions hardened into hostility. The Iron Curtain descended across Europe. The Cold War began. Critics would later argue that Eisenhower's restraint merely postponed the inevitable. Eisenhower accepted that possibility, but he also believed that postponement mattered. Time brought stability. Stability allowed recovery. Recovery prevented chaos. In his memoirs, Eisenhower wrote that the true test of command was not how aggressively one fought, but how responsibly one ended a fight. Ending a war, he believed, required more discipline than starting one. The temptation to seize every advantage had to be weighed against the cost of doing so. Eisenhower chose unity because he believed that a fractured victory would poison the peace before it could begin. He chose restraint because he understood that power exercised without trust invites resistance. He chose cooperation because he had seen what happened when alliances collapsed under strain. In the final accounting, Eisenhower's decision did not belong solely to April 1945. It echoed through decades of geopolitics that followed. The world that emerged from World War II was imperfect, divided, and tense. But it was not immediately consumed by another global war. For Eisenhower, that mattered more than any single city captured or line crossed on a map. And that is why at the end of the war, Dwight D. Eisenhower chose unity over results, not because he lacked ambition, but because he understood the cost of winning without it.